The thunder of monsoon rains drums against ancient stone. It is the 14th of November, 1751. Inside the crumbling fort at Arcot, capital of the Carnatic, a 26-year-old British clerk-turned-soldier stands at a breach in the wall. His name is Robert Clive, and at this moment he commands barely 300 men, 200 British soldiers, and fewer than 100 sepoys who haven't yet fled. Outside, 11,000 troops mass for the final assault. War elephants, their foreheads fitted with iron plates, wait to batter down the Delhi gate. French artillery has pounded the fort's walls for weeks. A practicable breach yawns open, inviting the enemy in. Clive's officers, those few civilians conscripted from East India Company counting houses, have loaded extra muskets and stacked them in relays. They know what's coming. The attack begins at dawn. Through the breach surge thousands of soldiers, climbing over rubble, screaming victory. The elephants charge the gate, their armored heads meant to splinter oak and iron. But something extraordinary happens in that hellish hour. British musket fire, disciplined and constant, tears into the attackers with mechanical precision. The elephants, maddened by wounds, turn upon their own troops, trampling hundreds. At the breach, Clive himself mans a cannon when its crew falls. The assault collapses within 60 minutes. By noon, the besieging army has melted away into the countryside, abandoning guns, ammunition, and any illusions about easy victory. Clive's impossible defense has succeeded. The ripples from this obscure siege in southern India will lap against the shores of British history for 2 centuries. Yet ask a dozen Britons today who Robert Clive was, and you'll receive mostly blank stares. Perhaps one might hazard, something to do with India? This is the paradox that brings us here. The man who laid the foundation for the British Raj, who transformed a commercial enterprise into an imperial power, who demonstrated that European discipline could defeat Asian numbers, remains largely forgotten outside specialist circles. He is overshadowed by later imperial heroes, Wellington, Gordon, Kitchener, whose victories were built upon the precedent Clive established. Between 1751 and 1757, in a period of merely 6 years, Robert Clive achieved what seemed impossible. He broke French imperial ambitions in India. He secured British control over Bengal, the richest province in the subcontinent. He pioneered the use of sepoy armies trained to European standards. He proved that audacity, combined with military competence, could overcome overwhelming numerical superiority. This is the story of those transformative years. It is the story of how a troubled young man with no military training became the architect of empire. It is the story of forgotten battles that shaped the modern world. It is the story of the birth of the British Raj. Robert Clive was born on the 29th of September, 1725, at Stike Hall in Shropshire, the ancestral estate of a minor gentry family. His father, Richard Clive, practiced law and managed the family lands with a temper described by contemporaries as violent and unpredictable. His mother, Rebecca, bore 13 children, of whom Robert was the eldest surviving son. The weight of family expectations settled upon his shoulders early. By all accounts, young Robert was an impossible child. Schoolmasters at Market Drayton despaired of him. He organized a protection racket amongst local shopkeepers, demanding tribute in exchange for leaving their windows intact. He climbed the church steeple and perched atop the gargoyles, terrifying parishioners below. His father sent him away to relations near Manchester, hoping distance might calm the boy's turbulent spirit. It did not. The defining characteristic was not malice, but rather a restless, ungovernable energy that found no constructive outlet in rural Shropshire. At 18, with limited prospects and having exhausted his family's patience, Clive accepted a position as a writer, a clerk with the East India Company. In those days, the company was primarily a trading concern, not yet the political power it would become. Writers copied ledgers, managed inventories, and performed the tedious administrative labor that sustained commerce. For a young man of spirit, it represented a kind of comfortable grave. Clive arrived in Madras in June 1744. The posting proved every bit as miserable as he had feared. The work was monotonous, the climate was oppressive, disease claimed Europeans with depressing regularity. Clive fell into debt, suffered from unnamed ailments, and sank into a depression that contemporary observers noted was severe. Stories circulated, never entirely confirmed, but persistent nonetheless, that he twice attempted to take his own life with a pistol that misfired both times. Whether apocryphal or not, the tale captures something essential about Clive's character, a darkness that would shadow him throughout his life, coexisting with remarkable courage. Salvation came through war. In 1746, during the War of Austrian Succession, French forces under Governor Dupleix captured Madras. The conflict in Europe had spilled into India, where French and British trading companies maintained rival outposts. Clive, made prisoner briefly before escaping, watched the French victory with professional interest. He observed how a relatively small force of disciplined European troops, supported by sepoys trained in European drill, could dominate vastly larger native armies. The lesson was clear. In India, military superiority lay not in numbers, but in organization, discipline, and firepower. When the war ended and Madras returned to British control under the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748, Clive made a decision that changed everything. He requested a transfer from the civil to the military service of the East India Company. He had no formal training. He had never studied tactics or strategy. But he possessed something perhaps more valuable, an instinctive understanding of warfare combined with absolute fearlessness. The military situation in southern India, when Clive joined the company's forces, was extraordinarily complex. The Mughal Empire, once the dominant power on the subcontinent, was in terminal decline. Regional powers struggled for supremacy in the vacuum. In the Carnatic, the coastal region around Madras, two claimants fought for the position of Nawab: Chanda Sahib, supported by the French, and Muhammad Ali Khan Walaja, supported increasingly by the British. Further inland, similar succession disputes racked Hyderabad. The French governor, Joseph-Francois Dupleix, was a man of vision and ambition. Operating from Pondicherry, he pursued a strategy of indirect rule, placing client rulers on various thrones through military support, and then extracting concessions and revenue. By 1750, Dupleix's strategy appeared to be succeeding brilliantly. French influence spread across southern India like spilled wine across a map. The British, more focused on trade than territory, seemed destined for irrelevance. Into this volatile situation stepped Lieutenant Robert Clive, recently commissioned and hungry for action. His opportunity came in 1751, when Chanda Sahib, the French-backed Nawab, besieged Muhammad Ali in his stronghold at Trichinopoly. The siege threatened to eliminate the last significant British ally in the Carnatic. British forces, such as they were, had been drawn into Trichinopoly to support Muhammad Ali. This left Madras dangerously exposed and the British position apparently hopeless. Clive proposed a strategy so audacious that it bordered on madness: attack Arcot, Chanda Sahib's capital, with a tiny force, compelling the Nawab to lift the siege of Trichinopoly and defend his own seat of power. It was classic strategic thinking: strike at the enemy's center of gravity rather than engage him where he is strong, but the odds were preposterous. Clive would march with merely 500 men, 200 Europeans, and 300 sepoys against a heavily garrisoned fortress more than 60 miles inland. The governor of Madras, Thomas Saunders, approved the plan immediately. He recognized both its strategic logic and its gambler's desperation. If Clive failed, the British would lose 500 men they could ill afford. If he succeeded, the entire calculus of power in the Carnatic would shift. Clive marched from Madras on the 26th of August, 1751. The monsoon rains had begun. His force crossed the River Pallor at Conjeveram, wading through chest-deep water. The men were drenched, their powder potentially ruined, their spirits questionable. Yet Clive drove them forward through the deluge. When scouts brought word that Arcot's garrison numbered over 1,000 men, Clive did not hesitate. He ordered a night march, approaching the fortress during a thunderstorm so violent that visibility dropped to yards. The psychological effect was devastating. The garrison, watching this tiny force advance through apocalyptic weather without pause, broke. By the time Clive's men reached the fort on the 31st of August, it stood empty. The defenders had fled into the countryside. Clive took possession of the Carnatic's capital without firing a shot, but holding Arcot would prove infinitely more difficult than taking it. News of Arcot's fall reached Chanda Sahib within days. The strategic implications were immediately clear. So long as the British held his capital, his legitimacy as Nawab dissolved like sugar in tea. French advisors urged caution. Trichinopoli remained the prize, but Chanda Sahib could not ignore the insult. He dispatched his son, Raju Sahib, with 4,000 troops and a French contingent under direct orders. Retake Arcot and crush this impudent British upstart. Clive used the brief respite to transform Arcot's decrepit fort into something defensible. He mounted captured guns on the walls. He drilled his sepoys relentlessly in musket loading and volley fire. He stockpiled ammunition. He positioned extra weapons at crucial points. Most importantly, he established an intelligence network amongst the local population, ensuring he would know when the enemy approached. Raju Sahib arrived on the 23rd of September, 1751, and immediately invested the fort. His army had swollen to 11,000 men, including 150 French troops with artillery. The disparity in numbers was approximately 20 to 1. By any conventional calculation, Clive's position was untenable. The young commander's response was characteristically aggressive. On the 24th of September, he sortied from the fort to attack the besiegers. The assault was driven back with losses. 2 officers dead, 31 Europeans killed or wounded. It was a harsh lesson. Clive had 500 men. He could not afford to lose 60 in a single morning. He retreated behind his walls and prepared for a siege. The bombardment began in early October. French siege guns, expertly handled, pounded Arcot's ancient walls. Day after day, the stonework crumbled. By late October, a practicable breach had opened military terminology for a gap wide enough for troops to assault in column. According to the customs of European warfare, Raju Sahib was entitled to demand surrender once a breach was established. If the garrison refused and was then taken by storm, no mercy need be shown. Raju Sahib sent his terms. Clive's reply was recorded as one of contemptuous defiance. He would not surrender. He would defend the breach until relieved or killed. This was not bravado. Clive had intelligence that a relief force was being organized in Madras. Marathas under Morari Rao had agreed to support the British. If Clive could hold for another fortnight, salvation might arrive. Raju Sahib hesitated. Ordering his men through the breach would result in horrific casualties. The British had positioned artillery to enfilade any assault. Better, perhaps, to starve them out. But time was his enemy. Every day the siege continued. More Carnatic chiefs questioned Chanda Sahib's authority. The French grew impatient. Finally, Raju Sahib's hand was forced by calendar and faith. The 13th of November, 1751, was the Muslim fast day commemorating Hassan and Hussein, martyrs of Shia Islam. Religious fervor could inspire soldiers to heroism that mere orders could not compel. Raju Sahib planned his assault for dawn on the 14th. The attack would focus on 2 points, the breach in the wall and the Delhi gate. War elephants, their heads fitted with armored plates, would batter the gate whilst infantry stormed the breach. The plan was sound, the numbers overwhelming. Victory appeared inevitable. Clive knew the assault was coming. His intelligence network had warned him of the date. He made his preparations with meticulous care. At the breach, he positioned his best troops with multiple loaded muskets stacked in relays. Each man could fire, set down the empty weapon, and immediately lift a loaded one. This would enable them to maintain a rate of fire far exceeding normal reload speeds. The wall guns were loaded with grape shot and positioned to sweep the breach at point-blank range. Every man knew his post and his task. Dawn on the 14th of November broke with war cries and drumbeats. Thousands of soldiers surged toward the breach, climbing over rubble, brandishing swords and spears. Behind them, French officers shouted orders. At the Delhi gate, the war elephants lurched forward, magnificent and terrifying, their armored heads lowered to batter. The British fire was withering. Volley after volley crashed into the attackers with mechanical precision. Men fell in heaps at the breach, their bodies forming an obstacle that hindered those climbing behind. At the gate, the elephants, struck by dozens of musket balls, went mad with pain. They turned on their own troops, trampling friend and foe indiscriminately, their screams mixing with human cries. Clive was everywhere. When a gun crew was struck down, he personally aimed and fired the piece into the mass of attackers. Officers rallied their men by example, standing exposed on the ramparts. The sepoys, seeing their European officers face death without flinching, held their ground and fired with steady discipline. The assault lasted 1 hour. By the time Raju Sahib ordered the retreat, the ground before the breach was carpeted with bodies. Contemporary accounts suggest 400 of his men fell in that single hour. The British losses were 6 killed and wounded. The disproportion is explained by defensive advantage and superior firepower, but also by something less tangible, the moral ascendancy that disciplined troops hold over larger but less cohesive forces. On the 15th of November, Raju Sahib withdrew. His army melted into the countryside, leaving behind siege guns, ammunition, and their aura of invincibility. Clive had held Arcot for 50 days against impossible odds. The relief force from Madras arrived shortly after to find the siege already lifted. The strategic consequences rippled outward immediately. Chanda Sahib's legitimacy as Nawab evaporated. Regional chiefs, who had submitted to French-backed authority, reconsidered their positions. The siege of Trichinopoly, deprived of resources and authority, began to falter. Most significantly, the myth of French military dominance in southern India shattered. Europeans watching from Pondicherry, Madras, and London understood that the balance of power had shifted. But the immediate military consequences were equally important. Clive followed up his defensive victory with aggressive pursuit. At Arni in December 1751, he defeated Raju Sahib's forces again in open battle. At Kavaripakam in February 1752, he won yet another victory, this time against combined French and native forces. Each victory reinforced the lesson. Disciplined troops under competent leadership could defeat numerically superior armies. By 1753, the Second Carnatic War was effectively decided. Duplaix's strategy lay in ruins. The French government, alarmed by the costs and unimpressed by the results, recalled him to Paris. The British, previously content with mere commercial access, now saw the possibility, the necessity, of territorial control. The East India Company's directors in London began to think in terms not of factories but of provinces. Clive, meanwhile, had married. On the 18th of February, 1753, in Madras, he wed Margaret Maskelyne, sister of the future Astronomer Royal. The union was apparently affectionate. She had traveled to India specifically to join him and would produce 9 children. In March 1753, Clive and his bride sailed for England. He was 27 years old, possessed of a modest fortune earned through prize money and company bonuses, and celebrated in London as a military hero. The homecoming was brief. Clive's health was poor. Persistent ailments contracted in India plagued him, but his ambition burned undiminished. In 1755, the company appointed him lieutenant colonel and deputy governor of Fort Street, David. He sailed back to India with his wife, ready to resume his martial career. He would not wait long for the opportunity. In Bengal, far to the north and east, events were unfolding that would dwarf even Arcot in historical significance. The Nawab of Bengal in 1756 was a young man named Siraj-ud-Dowlah. He had inherited his position the previous year at age 23, and he ruled Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa territories containing perhaps 30 million people and generating revenues that exceeded many European kingdoms. Bengal was wealthy beyond European comprehension. Rice, silk, saltpeter, textiles. Control of Bengal meant control of vast resources. Siraj-ud-Dowlah viewed the British with suspicion bordering on contempt. The East India Company maintained a fortified trading post at Calcutta Fort William, which Siraj regarded as a violation of sovereignty. When the British began strengthening Fort William's defenses in anticipation of renewed war with France, Siraj saw an intolerable provocation. In June 1756, he marched on Calcutta with an army of 50,000 men. Fort William fell after token resistance. The governor, Roger Drake, fled downriver to the company's ships with most of the European garrison, abandoning British civilians to their fate. Those captured, perhaps 146 souls, were imprisoned overnight in Fort William's punishment cell, a space measuring 14 feet by 18 feet. The heat, the crush of bodies, the lack of air. Contemporary accounts describe a horror that became known as the Black Hole of Calcutta. By morning, according to surviving testimony, only 23 prisoners remained alive. The numbers have been disputed by historians, but the atrocity became a rallying cry for British vengeance. News reached Madras in August 1756. Admiral Charles Watson commanded a squadron of 5 ships in Madras harbor. The company's forces in southern India could spare approximately 900 European troops and 1,500 sepoys. The relief expedition required a military commander of experience and aggression. There was no debate about the choice. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Clive received command of the Bengal expedition in October 1756. He sailed with Watson's squadron, arriving in the Hooghly River approaches to Calcutta in December. Siraj-ud-Dowlah, informed that a British force was approaching, withdrew most of his troops from the city. On the 2nd of January, 1757, Clive recaptured Calcutta with minimal resistance. But recapturing Calcutta was insufficient. Siraj-ud-Dowlah's army, vast and nearby, could retake the city whenever he wished. Clive needed a decisive victory or a decisive treaty. On the 5th of February, 1757, Siraj attacked the British position with perhaps 40,000 troops. The ensuing Battle of Calcutta, sometimes called the Battle of Hooghly, demonstrated again Clive's tactical competence. British artillery and disciplined volley fire broke up attack after attack. By day's end, Siraj withdrew, his forces having suffered heavy casualties whilst British losses remained modest. Recognizing military reality, Siraj-ud-Dowlah entered negotiations. The Treaty of Alinagar, signed in February 1757, restored company privileges, promised compensation for losses, and confirmed British fortification rights. Clive had won the immediate contest, but he understood that the young Nawab was fundamentally unreliable. So long as Siraj ruled Bengal, British interests would remain vulnerable. Clive began seeking alternatives. The Nawab's court teemed with ambitious nobles resentful of Siraj's authority. Chief amongst them was Mir Jafar, commander-in-chief of the Bengali army and husband of Siraj's aunt. Mir Jafar nursed grievances about his position and rewards. He was, in modern intelligence terminology, a recruitable asset. Through William Watts, the company's agent at Siraj's court in Murshidabad, Clive opened negotiations with Mir Jafar. The terms were straightforward: British military support in exchange for Mir Jafar assuming the position of Nawab. Once installed, Mir Jafar would confirm all company privileges, pay substantial compensation for the black hole and other grievances, and grant trading concessions. It was precisely the sort of arrangement Duplessis had pioneered. Clive, learning from his enemy, now employed the same strategy. Siraj-ud-Dawla, meanwhile, made his own calculations. The British represented one threat. Equally dangerous were his domestic rivals. In March 1757, Clive captured Chandernagore, the French settlement upriver from Calcutta, eliminating French military power in Bengal. This forced Siraj into a decision. On the 14th of June, 1757, he marched from Murshidabad with perhaps 50,000 troops. His objective: destroy the British before they became unmanageable. Clive faced an impossible decision. He commanded approximately 3,000 men, 800 Europeans, and 2,000 sepoys against an enemy force 15 times larger. His artillery consisted of 10 field pieces. Intelligence suggested that Mir Jafar's conspiracy was genuine, but conspiracies are notoriously unreliable. If Mir Jafar honored his agreement, victory was possible. If he betrayed the British instead, Clive would die with his entire command at a place called Plassey. On the 22nd of June, 1757, Clive called a council of war. The question was stark: advance toward Siraj's army or remain in defensive positions. Opinion divided. Some officers argued for caution, others urged attack. Clive himself appears to have wavered, highly unusual for a man of his decisive temperament. Finally, after consulting intelligence reports and weighing probabilities, he gave the order they would advance. The Battle of Plassey was fought on the 23rd of June, 1757, in a mango grove near the village of Palashi on the banks of the Hooghly River. Siraj's army deployed across a vast front, its left anchored by French artillery. Mir Jafar commanded the substantial portion of the army, but held his forces in reserve, honoring his secret agreement. The battle opened with an artillery duel as monsoon rains swept across the field. Clive positioned his tiny force in the mango grove, using the trees for cover. His plan was essentially defensive. Hold position, let superior British artillery and musketry break up enemy attacks, and wait for Mir Jafar's treachery to take effect. For several hours, the battle proceeded as Clive hoped. Siraj's troops advanced repeatedly and were repeatedly driven back by disciplined fire. The French artillery, though competently handled, could not overcome British defensive advantages. The turning point came in mid-afternoon. One of Siraj's subordinate commanders, Mir Madan Khan, led a cavalry charge against the British position. British artillery fire killed Mir Madan, and his death spread confusion through Siraj's ranks. Observing the disorder, Clive ordered an advance. His troops moved forward in perfect order, their muskets and artillery tearing gaps in the enemy line. Simultaneously, Mir Jafar's forces withdrew from the field entirely, leaving Siraj's remaining troops exposed on multiple flanks. By sunset, Siraj-ud-Dawla's army had disintegrated. The Nawab himself fled the battlefield, abandoning artillery, ammunition, and treasure. He was captured several days later and executed on Mir Jafar's orders. British casualties at Plassey totaled fewer than 70 killed and wounded. Siraj's losses ran into thousands, though exact figures remain disputed. The Battle of Plassey did not involve sophisticated tactics or dramatic charges. It was won through superior discipline, effective conspiracy, and enemy division. Yet its consequences exceeded any battle fought by British arms in the 18th century. Overnight, the East India Company became the effective ruler of Bengal. Mir Jafar, installed as Nawab, was entirely dependent on British military support. The company controlled not merely factories but provinces, revenues, and armies. Clive remained in Bengal as governor, consolidating British control and extracting the financial rewards promised by Mir Jafar. The sums involved were staggering by contemporary standards. Clive personally received £234,000, equivalent to tens of millions in modern currency, along with an annual jagir, land grant, worth £27,000 per year. The company received millions more. Officers and soldiers shared in the plunder. The wealth of Bengal flowed into British hands, but Clive also worked to institutionalize company rule. He reorganized the Sepoy army along more rigorous European lines, ensuring that future campaigns would have disciplined indigenous troops. He fortified Calcutta against any possible counterattack. He established relationships with key Bengali nobles, ensuring that resistance would be divided and manageable. Most significantly, he demonstrated to colleagues in London and Madras that territorial control could be profitable beyond mere trade. The foundation of the British Raj was laid not by government policy, but by a company employee, acting with minimal oversight. 1757 marks the moment when Britain's presence in India transformed from commercial to imperial. Everything that followed the expansion across the subcontinent, the formal assumption of imperial sovereignty, the administrative and military structures of British India built upon the precedent Clive established. Clive returned to England in 1760, immensely wealthy and celebrated as a national hero. Parliament granted him an Irish peerage as Baron Clive of Plassey. He purchased estates, entered politics, and attempted to live as a landed gentleman. But India had broken something in him. His health, never robust, deteriorated. He suffered from chronic pain, possibly gallstones, and consumed opium for relief. The depression that had plagued his youth in Madras returned with renewed force. In 1764, Clive accepted a second governorship of Bengal, returning to India to address corruption and mismanagement within the company's administration. His reforms were necessary but made him enemies. He instituted the dual system, whereby the company controlled revenue collection whilst leaving administration to puppet nawabs. He banned private trading by company employees, a reform that eliminated the source of most fortunes but also most corruption. He left India for the final time in 1767. His health ruined, but his administrative legacy secured. The final years were difficult. Parliamentary inquiries into company affairs scrutinized his fortune and his methods. Critics accused him of corruption, of brutality, of using his position for personal enrichment. Clive defended himself vigorously, famously declaring to Parliament, "I stand astonished at my own moderation." The comment was characteristically audacious, but missed the deeper point. Even if Clive had been moderate compared to what he might have taken, the system itself was extractive and exploitative. On the 22nd of November, 1774, Robert Clive died at his home in Berkeley Square, London. The cause was officially recorded as unknown, but contemporary evidence strongly suggests suicide by cutting his throat. He was 49 years old. The darkness that had shadowed him since his Madras days had finally won. History's judgment on Clive has shifted, repeatedly across 2.5 centuries. Victorians celebrated him as an imperial hero, a man who secured India for the crown through courage and brilliance. Early 20th century historians emphasized his administrative achievements and military innovations. Post-independence scholarship, particularly in India, has viewed him more critically, as an agent of conquest, a facilitator of exploitation, a man whose personal enrichment came at the expense of Bengali prosperity. Perhaps all these assessments contain truth. Clive was undeniably courageous. The Siege of Arcot proves that beyond dispute, he possessed genuine military talent, despite no formal training. His understanding of Indian politics and his willingness to employ intrigue demonstrated strategic sophistication, but he was also ruthless, greedy, and psychologically troubled. The wealth he extracted from Bengal contributed to famines that would kill millions. The precedent he set enabled a century of sometimes brutal imperial expansion. What remains beyond dispute is Clive's historical significance. The British Raj, which would dominate the Indian subcontinent for nearly 2 centuries, was born in the period between 1751 and 1757. The battles Clive fought, Arcot, Plassey, and dozens of smaller engagements established British military supremacy. The administrative systems he created became the foundation of colonial governance. The sepoy armies he trained would enable British control over a territory containing hundreds of millions of people. Modern military historians still study Clive's campaigns. His defense of Arcot remains a textbook example of using interior lines and disciplined firepower to offset numerical inferiority. His conspiracy against Siraj-ud-Dawla at Plassey demonstrates the importance of intelligence and political warfare alongside conventional military operations. His recognition that indigenous troops, properly trained and led, could be as effective as European soldiers anticipated the imperial practice of deploying native forces under European officers. Yet Clive is forgotten outside specialist circles. Britain has no Clive Day comparable to Trafalgar Day. His statue in Whitehall attracts little attention and occasional calls for removal. The military academies study his tactics but rarely celebrate his character. He occupies an uncomfortable position in British historical memory, too important to ignore, too problematic to celebrate. Perhaps this is appropriate. Clive lived at the hinge moment between commercial and territorial empire, between trading companies and imperial administration, between partnership with Indian rulers and domination over them. He embodied both the extraordinary individual courage that Britain celebrated and the exploitation that accompanied empire building. His victories secured prosperity for Britain and catastrophe for Bengal. He was both hero and villain, depending upon one's perspective. What we can say with certainty is that Robert Clive changed history. The India we know today, its borders, its languages, its administrative structures, its relationship with Britain all bear the imprint of decisions made between 1751 and 1757 by a troubled young man who transformed himself from a counting house clerk into an architect of empire. The British Raj was not inevitable. It required specific people making specific choices at specific moments. Clive was that person. Those were his choices. And those years between the Siege of Arcot and the Battle of Plassey were the moments when the future crystallized. His story reminds us that history is made by individuals flawed, complex, driven by ambition, fear, courage, and darkness in equal measure. It reminds us that military victory alone is insufficient. Political acumen and strategic vision matter equally. It reminds us that the great sweep of imperial history, visible from our modern perspective, was experienced by its participants as a series of impossible gambles and narrow escapes. Robert Clive gambled at Arcot and won. He gambled at Plassey and won again. Had either gamble failed, the history of India and Britain would have unfolded very differently. But they succeeded, and the consequences reverberate still. That is why this forgotten figure deserves remembering, not for uncomplicated celebration, but for understanding the complex, uncomfortable ways that empire was built and the extraordinary individuals, for good and ill, who built it.